I woke up to the sharp crack of metal snapping in the driveway just before 7 in the morning. For a split second, I thought someone was breaking into the shed behind my grandmother's house. Then I looked out the window and saw her, a woman in a silk robe, standing like she belonged there, bolt cutters still in her hands, staring down at my Jeep like it was trash she'd finally decided to throw away. That Jeep wasn't just mine. It was government-issued, clearly marked, and tied directly to the federal task force I was assigned to overseas. Anyone with eyes could see that. But the HOA board leader, Karen Whitmore, didn't care. She had already called a tow truck and was shouting orders, waving paperwork around like it made her untouchable. The worst part was I wasn't even there. I was deployed, half a world away, trusting that my grandmother's house would be left alone. Instead, my sister was standing in the doorway, phone shaking in her hands, recording everything as Karen cut my lock and calmly announced the Jeep was an unauthorized eyesore. That was the exact moment it stopped being petty and nonsense. She didn't just break a rule. She crossed a line she didn't even know existed. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Gone Wild. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? When people hear HOA, they picture some nosy neighbor measuring grass with a ruler. I used to think that too. I thought the rules were annoying, sure, but harmless. That was before Maple Crest Estates, before Cedar Ridge, before I learned what happens when one person gets a little power, a little letterhead, and a whole neighborhood too scared to say no. My name is Marcus Hayes. Most folks back home just call me Mark. I'm an Army Reserve military police officer, and for the last stretch of my life, I've been bouncing between training, shifts, and deployments. I don't talk about what I do in detail, even with family, but the short version is this. I was attached to a federal task force working a case that had been building for months. The kind of case where you don't run your mouth. The kind of case where you don't park certain vehicles just anywhere. And the kind of case where you definitely don't let some random civilian cut a lock and tow anything connected to it. The only reason I was even in Maple Crest Estates in the first place was my grandmother. Eleanor Hayes was the closest thing I ever had to a safe place. She wasn't wealthy. She wasn't flashy. She was the type of woman who could make you feel full just by putting a hand on your shoulder and telling you to sit down. Her house in Cedar Ridge wasn't some mansion. It was a simple little place, tidy porch, flower beds she babied like children, and a kitchen that smelled like warmth even when nobody was cooking. She held that house together through everything. When I was younger and my life was a mess, she never once made me feel like a burden. When I joined up, she was proud in a quiet way, like she didn't want to brag but couldn't help it. And toward the end, when her health started slipping, she still refused to complain. The last real conversation we had was her telling me, "This house stays in the family. People like us don't quit on what we've built." So when she passed, I didn't sell it. I didn't even consider selling it. I kept it because it felt like keeping her voice alive, because every floorboard had a memory, because it wasn't about profit, it was about respect. The problem was I couldn't stay there full time. When my orders came through, I had to leave. Fast. The task force work meant long stretches away, unpredictable schedules, and the kind of responsibility that doesn't care if you've got grief sitting on your chest back home. I did what I thought was the responsible thing. I locked everything down, set the bills on autopay, and asked my sister, Allison, to stay in the house while I was gone. Allison is younger than me by a couple years, but she's always been the one with the steady mind. She teaches middle school. She's organized, calm, the type who keeps folders for everything, and can remember every detail of a conversation a week later. If I'm a hammer, she's a level. If anything went sideways, I trusted her to handle it. At first, things were quiet. Maple Crest looked like one of those neighborhoods that gets used in real estate ads. Curved sidewalks, identical mailboxes, lawns cut in perfect stripes like someone ironed them. The kind of quiet where you can hear a sprinkler 3 houses down. Even the air felt filtered, like the place had rules for breathing. And in a way it did. Maple Crest Estates wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a system. There were signs at every entrance about community standards. There were HOA notices tucked into door handles like warnings. The people smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes. Like everyone was friendly, as long as you didn't give them a reason not to be. Allison told me about the HOA board leader within the first week, Karen Whitmore. She wasn't just involved, Allison said. She ran things. She showed up in a neat blazer, even to casual events, like the neighborhood was her office. People lowered their voices when she walked by. The older residents nodded like they owed her something. And the newer ones looked nervous, like they were still learning how the game worked. Allison tried to give her the benefit of the doubt at first. Maybe she's just strict, she told me on one of our calls. Maybe she's trying to keep the place nice. Then the first violation notice showed up. It came only a few days after I left. A crisp white envelope, a letterhead, Naafna MPLANCU, stamped across the front in bold. Allison opened it expecting something minor. A trash can left out too long. A weed in a flower bed. Instead, it was about my Jeep. The notice called it an unauthorized commercial vehicle and claimed it violated appearance regulations. It demanded removal within a short window and threatened fines that would accumulate daily until compliance is achieved. Allison read it twice, then called me confused, because the Jeep didn't look commercial. It wasn't some rusty work truck leaking oil. It was clean, maintained, and clearly marked as government issued. It had official decals. It had identification numbers. The kind of markings that make most people step back, not step forward. Allison did what a reasonable person would do. She went straight to Karen Whitmore. She brought the paperwork. She brought my deployment documents. She explained calmly that I was overseas and that the vehicle was government issued and not something we could just hide in a garage like a lawnmower. Karen didn't even blink. Allison told me later that Karen looked at the papers like they were a child's excuse note. She gave this thin smile and said, "Military or not, standards are standards." Allison tried again. "He's deployed. This is his grandmother's home. We're just trying to keep everything safe until he returns." Karen's smile didn't change. "Then you should have thought about that before you parked it here." That's when Allison realized this wasn't about rules. It was about control. Karen hinted that fines could get expensive fast. She said it like she was warning Allison, but it felt more like a threat. And then she dropped the line that made my stomach tighten even through a crackly overseas call. "I have connections," Karen said. "County level. You don't want this to become a bigger issue." Allison left that conversation shaking, not because she was scared of a fine, but because she could hear the message underneath it. "Comply, or I will make your life harder." And the thing Karen didn't understand, the thing she couldn't understand, was that the Jeep wasn't decorative. It wasn't optional. It wasn't just a vehicle sitting pretty in a driveway. It was tied to real work, real people, real consequences. And if Karen was willing to threaten my sister over it, I had a feeling she was willing to do a lot worse. That was only the beginning. After that first notice, everything sped up in a way that felt deliberate. Like Karen had decided that if she moved fast enough, She could bury us before anyone had time to think. Allison stopped getting normal letters and started getting emails instead. The subject lines were always aggressive. Camp-plancrqir, Ingi, I'm underage AFT1, Nini Didi. Every one of them sounded like the end of the world. But when Allison read them closely, there was never a specific rule listed. No section numbers, no bylaw references. Just vague phrases about community appearance and board discretion. It was intimidation dressed up as procedure. The deadlines were impossible. One notice demanded action within 24 hours. Another gave her until end of business day. Even though it arrived late in the afternoon, Allison called the HOA office and got voicemail. She emailed back asking for clarification and was ignored. Then the fines started appearing on the account ledger, stacking day by day like a countdown clock. Within a week, 2 trucks started appearing on the street. Not parked, circling. Allison noticed them creeping past the house in the mornings and again in the evenings. Slow rolls. Drivers staring too long. One of them even stopped at the corner like he was waiting for a signal. The neighbors noticed too. Curtains moved. People stood on porches pretending to check their phones. Nobody said anything out loud, but the energy changed. The block felt watched. What bothered Allison the most was the pattern. She started paying attention and realized it wasn't just us. 2 houses down, a guy who had served in the Marines got cited for a flag bracket being properly mounted. Across the street, a woman whose husband was active duty received a warning about her trash cans being visible for excessive duration, even though they were out for less time than everyone else's. Meanwhile, Karen's friends had overgrown hedges, faded paint, and vehicles parked wherever they wanted without a single notice. Selective enforcement, plain and simple. Allison started documenting everything. Screenshots, photos, dates, and times written in a notebook she kept on the kitchen table. Every time a tow truck passed, she wrote it down. Every time Karen walked by the driveway, phone raised, snapping pictures of my Jeep from different angles. Allison filmed from inside the house. Karen didn't even try to be subtle anymore. One afternoon, Allison caught her stepping fully onto the driveway, walking slow circles around the Jeep, crouching down to photograph the tires, the bumper, the decals. Allison opened the door and told her she was trespassing. Karen didn't flinch. "This is a compliance inspection," she said. Like that explained everything. "You don't have permission to be here." Allison replied, her voice shaking despite herself. Karen smiled that thin smile again. "HOA authority," she said. "We don't need permission." That line hit me like a punch when Allison told me later. I was calling in from overseas whenever I could, sitting in dimly lit rooms between shifts, trying to stay calm while listening to my sister describe my grandmother's driveway turning into a surveillance zone. Every call ended the same way. Me pacing, clenching my jaw, wanting to do something. Allison apologizing for being stressed, even though she was the one dealing with it alone. The distance made it worse. I couldn't show up. I couldn't stand in front of Karen and tell her to back off. All I could do was listen, advise, and remind Allison to keep recording. Karen escalated again by sending a notice claiming the Jeep posed a potential safety concern. That was new. Vague. Dangerous wording. The kind of language that sounded like it was laying groundwork for something bigger. That's when Allison decided to dig deeper. My grandmother kept everything, old manuals, receipts, OA welcome packets from when the neighborhood was first built. Allison spent an entire evening going through boxes in the spare bedroom until she found a thick folder labeled Maple Crest Estates, Original Documents. Inside were the original bylaws. Not summaries, not updates, the actual founding documents. And right there, in plain language, was a clause that stopped Allison cold. a section that explicitly exempted government-owned and service-related vehicles from appearance restrictions, as long as they were properly marked and maintained. Allison read it 3 times to make sure she wasn't imagining it. The Jeep wasn't in violation. It never had been. The next morning, she printed the pages, highlighted the relevant section, and walked straight to Karen's door. Karen barely glanced at the papers. "These are outdated," she said, handing them back like junk mail. "All right," Allison replied, keeping her voice steady. "Can you show me the updated version, the one that removes this exemption?" Karen's expression hardened. "The board has discretion." "That's not an answer," Allison said. "Where is the updated rule?" Karen crossed her arms. "I'm not required to provide internal documents on demand." That was the moment Allison knew Karen was bluffing. If the rules had actually been updated, Karen would have thrown them in Allison's face. Instead, she was hiding behind vague authority and hoping Allison wouldn't push harder. But Allison did push. She emailed the bylaws to the HOA address, attached screenshots, and politely requested confirmation of the specific rule being enforced. Karen responded hours later with a single sentence. "Compliance will proceed as scheduled." No explanation, no citation, no denial of the exemption, just a statement. Then came the final message. Allison found it in her inbox that evening, marked urgent, bolded, and cold. It stated that enforcement action would occur regardless of objections. It warned that obstruction could result in additional penalties, and it ended with a sentence that felt personal. If the vehicle is not removed voluntarily, the association will arrange removal. When Allison called Karen to ask what that meant, Karen didn't bother pretending anymore. "We're towing it," she said. "And if you think you can stop it, you're welcome to try." Allison hung up with her hands shaking, standing alone in my grandmother's kitchen, staring at the driveway through the window. Karen had just dared us to stop her, and she had no idea what she was about to touch. Karen's threat was the point where I stopped trying to handle this like a normal neighborhood dispute. Up until then, I had been telling myself it was just another HOA bully who would fold the second real authority showed up. But when Allison told me Karen was moving forward with a tow despite clear exemptions, despite documentation, despite common sense, something clicked. This wasn't ignorance. This was confidence. The kind that only comes from thinking you're untouchable. The very next chance I got, I contacted military legal support. I didn't sugarcoat it. I laid everything out. The deployment. The government-issued Jeep. The violation notices with no rule citations. The threats. The tow trucks circling. And finally, the bolt cutter threat hanging in the air. The response was immediate. The judge-advocate officer didn't hesitate or ask me to calm down. Instead, her tone shifted the moment I mentioned the vehicle and its connection to federal work. She told me, flat out, that what was happening qualified as harassment of a deployed service member's property. More than that, she said any attempt to seize or tamper with the vehicle could trigger serious consequences well outside HOA jurisdiction. That was the first time I felt like I could breathe again. She advised me to stop engaging directly with the HOA and to document everything. Every notice, every threat, every unauthorized entry. She also told me something that stuck with me. "Do not warn them," she said. "Let them show us who they are." That same day, I contacted my federal supervisor. I expected frustration. Maybe a lecture about distractions. Instead, I got calm professionalism. I explained what was happening, careful with my words, knowing certain details didn't belong on an open line. There was a pause on the other end, and then he said something that told me this had just changed lanes entirely. "Do not intervene," he said. "Do not confront. Let it play out. If they cross the line, we want it clean. Clean evidence. clean timelines, no ambiguity. I relayed everything to Allison. She listened quietly, then nodded like she'd already made the same decision. If Karen wanted to play authority, we were going to let her do it on camera. Allison installed security cameras that afternoon. Nothing flashy. Just clear coverage of the driveway, the street, and the approach to the Jeep. She positioned them carefully, making sure there were no blind spots. Every angle was covered. The setup felt surreal. My grandmother's house had gone from a place of comfort to a monitored zone. Karen noticed immediately. The next day, Allison saw unfamiliar vehicles parked near the HOA office. By the end of the week, Karen had hired private security. They wore black uniforms with clipboards and radios, standing at the neighborhood entrance like bouncers at a club. Karen called it compliance monitoring. Everyone else saw it for what it was, intimidation. Neighbors stopped lingering outside. Kids were called inside earlier. Conversations ended when security walked past. The presence alone changed the atmosphere, like a low hum of tension running through the streets. Karen's confidence grew with every step. She began sending notices that referenced documented observations by security personnel. She claimed the Jeep was being monitored for potential violations. She even suggested that the vehicle could contain unapproved modifications. That language made my blood run cold. Then the footage started coming in. Late one night, Allison reviewed the camera feed and saw two security guards standing beside the Jeep. One of them shined a flashlight under the frame. The other leaned close to the door, peering inside. They spoke quietly, but the audio picked up enough to make the intent clear. "Looks like equipment," one of them said. "Yeah," the other replied. "Probably something inside, too." They weren't talking about paint or parking. They were speculating about the contents of a federal vehicle. Allison watched the clip 3 times before sending it to me. I forwarded it to military legal support and my supervisor without a single word added. I didn't need to explain. The footage spoke for itself. That was the moment this stopped being about HOA fines. Security guards had no authority to inspect, speculate about, or interfere with that Jeep. Karen either didn't understand that, or she didn't care. And either option was bad for her. The judge advocate officer responded quickly. She confirmed what we already knew. Any further interference would escalate this beyond administrative remedies. The federal side was now watching. Karen, of course, had no idea. She continued acting like she was untouchable. She told neighbors the Jeep was under investigation. She claimed she was protecting the community. She leaned harder into the narrative that HOA authority was absolute inside Maple Crest Estates. Allison started seeing the bigger picture. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules. She was performing power. She expected people to fold the moment she raised her voice or flashed paperwork. And for years, that had probably worked. No one wanted to be the one who challenged her. No one wanted to risk fines, harassment, or social isolation. Karen had built her control on the assumption that nobody would push back. What she didn't know was that pushing back wasn't our plan. Letting her keep going was. Because every step she took, every order she gave, every unauthorized inspection was turning her authority into evidence. And she was documenting her own downfall without realizing it. Once the cameras were up and the legal lines were drawn, Allison stopped reacting emotionally and started operating methodically. She turned my grandmother's dining table into a command center, a notebook for handwritten notes, a laptop for digital files, a folder for printed notices. Everything had a place. Every interaction had a timestamp. Every time an email came in from the HOA, Allison saved it as a file and backed it up. Every notice taped to the door was photographed before it was touched. Every time Karen or the private security guards stepped near the driveway, Allison noted the date, the time, and what they did. She even started logging the tow trucks when they cruised by, noting the company names and license plates when she could. What Karen thought was pressure turned into evidence. But Karen didn't slow down. She changed tactics. The tone of the notices shifted. The language got darker. Where before it had been about appearance, now it was about safety. Karen began telling neighbors that my Jeep was not appropriate for a residential area. She hinted that it could be dangerous, that it might contain things the community should be worried about. Allison heard about it secondhand at first. A neighbor asking if everything was okay. Someone else mentioning that Karen had said the Jeep was under investigation. Then it started getting more personal. Karen began questioning Allison herself. She told people Allison was emotional, that she was overreacting, that she was being difficult and uncooperative. She framed it like concern, but the message underneath was clear. Discredit the sister, weaken the resistance. It worked on some people. Allison started noticing the looks. Conversations stopping when she walked by. Parents at her school asking careful questions that felt less like curiosity and more like probing. One administrator pulled her aside and asked if everything was all right at home, citing community chatter. That hit Allison harder than the fines ever could. She was doing everything right. She was following the rules. She was protecting family property. And somehow, she was the one being painted as unstable. She called me that night and tried to sound calm, but I could hear it in her voice. The strain, the exhaustion, the fear that this wasn't just about a driveway anymore, but about her reputation and career. I wanted to tell her to pack up and leave, to get out before Karen did more damage. But we both knew that would be exactly what Karen wanted. Instead, we doubled down. Around that time, another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The Jeep had tracking and access logs tied to its systems. Nothing fancy that Allison could manipulate, but enough to record proximity alerts and movement attempts. When we reviewed the logs against Allison's documentation, the overlap was impossible to ignore. The system recorded repeated proximity alerts late at night and early in the morning. Alerts that lined up perfectly with times Karen had claimed she was not present or unaware of any activity. Every alert matched a camera clip. Karen standing near the Jeep, Karen photographing it, security guards inspecting it. She was lying, repeatedly, and now there was data to prove it. Allison organized the logs into a clean timeline. She didn't add commentary. She didn't speculate. She just let the facts sit next to each other and speak for themselves. Anyone looking at it could see the pattern. Karen wasn't enforcing rules from a distance. She was personally involved at every step. Karen, meanwhile, seemed energized by the chaos. She sent out a neighborhood-wide email about upcoming compliance actions. She framed it like a community service announcement, full of vague phrases about safety and standards. No names mentioned, but everyone knew who it was about. Then she posted a notice on the HOA bulletin board. Emergency compliance action scheduled. Allison took a photo of it and sent it to me immediately. That phrase wasn't in the bylaws. It wasn't defined anywhere. It was something Karen had invented to make the situation feel urgent and unavoidable. The implication was obvious. The tow was coming. Karen followed it up with a direct message to Allison. Short, cold, carefully worded. The association would proceed with enforcement. Objections had been noted and denied. Failure to cooperate could result in additional penalties. No date was listed at first. No time. Just pressure. That night, Allison barely slept. She stayed up watching the camera feeds, listening for engines, jumping at every noise. Around midnight, a security vehicle rolled slowly past the house and paused longer than usual. Allison logged it, saved the footage, added it to the growing file. Early the next morning, her phone buzzed. It was an email from Karen sent before sunrise. The subject line read, "Final notice." Inside, there was no legal language, no references, just one sentence that made Allison's hands go cold. "Enforcement will occur tomorrow morning." That was it. No discussion, no appeal, no explanation, just a declaration. Allison stood in the kitchen, staring at the driveway through the same window where my grandmother used to drink her morning coffee. The Jeep sat exactly where it always had, quiet and untouched, unaware of the drama swirling around it. Karen had made her move, and by scheduling it so publicly, so confidently, she had just given us the one thing we needed most. A fixed moment, a line in time, a chance to let her step fully over it in the clearest way possible. The morning Karen chose arrived heavy and quiet, the kind of stillness that makes every sound feel louder than it should. Allison had been awake since before dawn, sitting at the kitchen table with her phone charging beside her and the camera feeds pulled up on her laptop. The house felt tense, like it was holding its breath. Outside, the driveway looked exactly the same as it always had. The Jeep sat there, locked, clean, unmoving. Nothing about it suggested chaos, but we both knew what was coming. Just before 7 in the morning, a familiar sedan rolled slowly down the street and stopped directly in front of the house. Allison recognized it instantly. Karen Whitmore stepped out, not in her usual blazer this time, but wearing a silk robe pulled tight at the waist, her hair still perfect. She didn't look rushed. She didn't look nervous. She looked confident, like someone about to prove a point. The cameras caught everything. Karen walked straight up the driveway without hesitation, carrying a set of bolt cutters like she had done this 100 times before. She didn't knock. She didn't announce herself. She crouched by the Jeep, positioned the cutters around the lock, and squeezed. The sound of metal snapping echoed through the quiet street. Allison felt sick watching it happen live. There was no ambiguity, no misunderstanding. Karen wasn't threatening anymore. She was acting. She pulled the broken lock free, dropped it onto the concrete, and waved toward the street like she was calling someone forward. Moments later, a tow truck turned the corner. The driver stepped out slowly, clipboard in hand, clearly expecting a routine pickup. Then he looked at the Jeep. He stopped walking. He leaned closer. He read the markings. His body language changed instantly. Allison could hear him on the audio asking Karen if this was some kind of mistake. Karen's voice came through sharp and impatient. She told him it was authorized. She told him the HOA had approved it. She told him to do his job. The driver shook his head. He said he wasn't touching it. He said the vehicle was clearly government issued, and that towing it could get him into serious trouble. He told Karen he needed written authorization from the proper authority, not an HO notice. Karen lost it. Her voice rose, echoing down the street as neighbors began peeking out from behind curtains and doors. She told him that HOA authority overrode everything inside Maple Crest Estates. She said federal markings didn't matter. She said she ran this community, and she was done asking for permission. The driver backed away, hands up, repeating that he refused. He climbed back into his truck and started the engine. Karen stood there fuming, humiliated in front of witnesses, her plan unraveling on camera. Then she did something even worse. She pulled out her phone and made another call. Within minutes, security vehicles appeared at the entrance to the neighborhood. Karen started barking orders, pointing toward the gate, telling them to lock it down. The guards hesitated, confused, but she kept pressing, insisting it was an emergency compliance action. The gate closed. The sound of it sliding shut was unmistakable. That single decision changed everything. By locking the gate, Karen wasn't just throwing a tantrum. She was blocking access to a vehicle tied to federal work. She was interfering with retrieval. She was asserting control over something she had absolutely no jurisdiction over. Allison didn't hesitate. She sent me the footage in real time. Her message short and shaking. She cut the lock. The gate is locked. I stepped away from what I was doing overseas and made the call I had hoped I wouldn't need to make. I contacted my supervisor and told him everything had just crossed the line. Not hypothetically. Not soon, now. I forwarded the footage, the timestamps, the audio, the locked gate. There was no debate on the other end. He told me federal authorities were being notified immediately. Back in Cedar Ridge, Karen was still performing. She paced the driveway, talking loudly to security, gesturing at the Jeep like it was a prop in her personal show of dominance. A neighbor finally asked her what she thought she was doing. Karen snapped back without hesitation. "This is my community," she said. "Federal rules do not apply here." The cameras caught that too. That sentence. Those exact words. When Allison replayed it later, she realized how calm Karen sounded when she said it. Not angry, not panicked, certain. Karen genuinely believed it. She believed that an HOA badge, a clipboard, and years of no one challenging her gave her authority above everything else. She believed the gates made her sovereign. She believed nobody would call her bluff. Within the hour, the mood shifted again. Security guards started whispering among themselves. One of them stepped away to make a phone call of his own. Neighbors gathered in small clusters, no longer hiding. The street that had been silent for weeks was suddenly alive with murmurs. Karen didn't notice at first. She was too busy insisting she was right. But the moment she said she didn't recognize federal jurisdiction, the outcome was no longer in her hands. She had done more than harass a family or abuse HOA power. She had openly declared herself above the law. And that was the moment her authority stopped being threatening and started being evidence. She didn't know it yet, standing there in her robe with a broken lock at her feet. But Karen Whitmore had just sealed her own fate in front of an entire neighborhood. The first federal vehicle didn't come in fast or loud. It rolled up to the neighborhood gate slow and deliberate, lights on, but sirens off, like it didn't need to announce itself. By the time the second one followed, people were already outside. Doors opened. Phones came out. Neighbors who had spent weeks pretending nothing was wrong suddenly felt brave enough to watch. Karen saw them before she understood what they were. At first, she squared her shoulders like she always did, hands on her hips, ready to argue. Then the uniform registered. Then the badges. Then, the fact that the gate she had ordered locked was now being opened without anyone asking her permission. Her confidence cracked in real time. Federal marshals stepped through the gate calmly, professionally, already aware of exactly where they were going. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't rush. They walked straight toward the driveway like they owned it, because in that moment, they did. Karen started talking before anyone addressed her. "This is an HOA matter," she said loudly. "You're trespassing. You need to leave." One of the marshals stopped and looked at her, not angry, not amused, just steady. He asked her if she had cut the lock on the vehicle in question. Karen hesitated, just for a second. Then she nodded and said yes, because lying didn't even occur to her anymore. She was used to people backing down when she spoke. That marshal explained, clearly and carefully, that the vehicle was tied to an active federal task force. That cutting the lock, attempting to seize it, and restricting access to it constituted interference with a federal asset. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten. He stated it like a fact. Karen's face drained of color. She immediately shifted blame. She pointed at the private security guards and said they were responsible, that they were acting on their own, that she had only been following procedure. The guards looked at each other, then back at the marshals, and one of them spoke up. He said Karen had given the orders. He said she had told them to lock the gate. He said she had instructed them to monitor the vehicle despite their concerns. Another guard added that they had emails, text messages, instructions. Karen turned on them instantly, accusing them of lying, of betrayal, of misunderstanding her authority. But the marshals were already collecting statements, already reviewing footage, already receiving files that Allison had prepared weeks earlier. The paper trail hit all at once. Emails with no rule citations, notices with fabricated language, security invoices approved by Karen personally, camera footage of unauthorized inspections, audio of her claiming federal rules did not apply. And then there was the lock. One marshal picked it up off the driveway, holding it carefully in an evidence bag, while another asked Karen's full name. The crowd had grown by then. Neighbors stood openly now, no longer whispering. Some looked stunned. Some looked angry. A few looked relieved. Phones recorded everything. Karen's phone started buzzing in her hand. She answered it, her voice suddenly softer, more frantic. She mentioned her husband. She said his name like it was a shield. Her husband arrived not long after. He was a local official, used to walking into rooms where people listened. But when he approached the marshals and tried to intervene, it didn't work the way he expected. His presence didn't stop the process. It complicated it. The marshals asked him a few questions, then a few more. Then they asked about his communications with the HOA, about calls made on Karen's behalf, about pressure applied behind the scenes. His confidence faltered too. One of the HOA board members showed up, then another. They stood together for a moment, watching Karen unravel, watching authority they had hidden behind turn into a liability. One by one, they started backing away. One resigned on the spot, saying he had no idea things had gone this far. Another claimed she had voted against enforcement and produced messages to prove it. The board collapsed right there in the street, not in a meeting room, not behind closed doors, but in front of everyone they had controlled. Karen tried one last time to assert herself. She said she was protecting the community. She said she had done nothing wrong. She said she was being targeted unfairly. But her voice was shaking now. The marshals told her she was being detained pending further investigation. They explained her rights. They explained what would happen next. They didn't rush her. They didn't humiliate her. They simply removed the illusion she had been living in. As they guided her away from the driveway, Karen looked around like she expected someone to stop it, someone to defend her, someone to remind everyone who she was. No one did. Neighbors watched silently as the woman who had ruled Maple Crest Estates with notices and threats was escorted past them. Some shook their heads, some crossed their arms. One older man quietly said, "About time." The Jeep stayed exactly where it was, untouched, secured, surrounded now not by intimidation, but by actual authority. By the time Karen was placed into the vehicle, the street felt different, lighter, like something heavy had finally been lifted. Her power hadn't been taken from her by force. It had evaporated the moment it was exposed to reality. The days after Karen was detained felt unreal, like the neighborhood was waking up from a long, uncomfortable dream. The street was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. Not the tense, watched silence that had settled over Maple Crest Estates for weeks. This one felt cautious, almost fragile, like everyone was testing whether it was finally safe to breathe. Formal notices started going out almost immediately. HOA enforcement actions were suspended pending investigation, not paused, not reviewed, suspended. Allison read the message 3 times before it really sank in. For the first time since I deployed, the stream of threats stopped cold. No emails. No tape notices. No security vehicles idling at the curb. The fines vanished next. The account ledger was corrected, all charges removed. and a formal acknowledgement issued stating that the Jeep had never been in violation. Seeing that in writing hit harder than I expected. Weeks of stress, fear, and pressure wiped away with a few sentences. It didn't erase what Karen had done, but it proved what we had been saying all along. We were right. The Jeep itself was secured later that same day. Federal personnel documented its condition, verified there had been no damage beyond the cut lock, and ensured it remained exactly where it belonged. No one touched it after that. Not security. Not the HOA. Not even curious neighbors. It became almost symbolic, sitting there untouched, a reminder of how badly power had been misused. And then the stories started coming out. Once Karen's grip was broken, neighbors began knocking on the door. Some came cautiously, like they were still afraid of being seen. Others came angry, holding folders of their own notices and fines. Allison listened to every single one of them. There was the retired couple who had been fined repeatedly for a fence they were told was suddenly non-compliant after 10 years. The single mother who had been threatened with liens over landscaping issues she could not afford to fix. The veteran down the street who admitted he had been cited so often he stopped flying his flag altogether just to avoid the attention. None of them had spoken up before, not because they didn't want to, but because Karen had made sure it always felt safer to stay quiet. With enforcement suspended, the rest of the HOA board tried to distance themselves. Some claimed ignorance. Others said they had trusted Karen to handle things appropriately. But the damage was done. Emails and votes surfaced showing who had gone along with what, and the community had finally had enough. A recall election was organized. For the first time in years, people showed up in person. They asked questions. They demanded answers. They voted. One by one, the remaining board members were removed, replaced by interim volunteers who had no interest in control, only repair. Allison played a big role in that shift, though she never sought it out. Neighbors started asking her for advice. How to document things, how to request records, how to push back without escalating. She shared what she had learned, patiently, without bitterness. She explained that the rules mattered, but so did transparency. That authority only worked when it was accountable. Word spread beyond Maple Crest Estates. Other nearby communities reached out, asking questions, wanting to know how things had gone so wrong and how they could avoid the same fate. Allison didn't posture or preach. She just told the truth. She talked about documentation, about staying calm, about not backing down just because someone raised their voice. Slowly, the neighborhood changed. People started talking to each other again. Kids played outside without parents watching from behind curtains. Neighbors waved instead of avoiding eye contact. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't instant, but it was real. When I finally returned home, months later, the house felt like my grandmother's again. The porch was quiet. The flowers were blooming. Allison sat at the kitchen table, drinking coffee the way Eleanor used to, and for the first time in a long while, the conversation wasn't about threats or deadlines or cameras. It was about rebuilding. What stayed with me most wasn't Karen's downfall or the charges or the public unraveling of her authority. It was how quickly fear dissolved once people realized they weren't alone. Once one person stood up, others found the courage to follow. Maple Crest Estates wasn't perfect anymore. It was better. Because trust, once broken, doesn't come back through rules or notices or power. It comes back when people decide they're done being afraid and start holding each other up instead. When I finally came home months later, the first thing I noticed wasn't the Jeep in the driveway or the fresh paint on the mailboxes. It was the quiet, not the tense, artificial quiet Maple Crest used to have, but the kind that feels earned. The house felt like my grandmother again, warm, still, safe. I stood in the doorway for a long time, just listening, letting it settle in. It took a while to process everything that had happened. For a long time, Karen's power had existed because people believed in it. They believed the notices. They believed the threats. They believed it was easier to comply than to question. Silence gave her room to grow. Fear gave her authority. What changed everything wasn't shouting or retaliation. It was documentation. Cameras, paper trails, calm decisions made under pressure. The moment everything was written down and timed and verified, her authority stopped being intimidating and started being fragile. Karen's downfall wasn't revenge. No one set out to destroy her. She simply ran into consequences she never thought would apply to her. The rules she twisted became the evidence that ended her control. That experience taught me something I won't forget. OA power only exists as long as people accept it without question. The moment you ask for proof, the moment you stay calm and stand together, that power starts to collapse under its own weight. If there's one thing I hope this story leaves you with, it's this: you don't have to be loud to win. You don't have to be reckless. You just have to be steady, prepared, and willing to stand your ground the right way. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Gone Wild. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?